Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our second webinar of our Healthcare Innovation Leaders Series. I think we can all agree that we'd rather be doing this in person, but given the current environment and the challenges it brings, we really appreciate everyone making the time. And we think we have a worthwhile and an important agenda to cover today. We'll have more on that later. Let me introduce our guest speakers. Today, I'm joined by Harry Glorikian and Paul Kenny. Gentlemen, can you please say hello?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Josh.
Hey. Harry has 3 decades of experience building successful ventures in North America. He is a former entrepreneur in residence for GE Ventures, the author of Moneyball Medicine, and the host of Moneyball Medicine podcast. Currently, Harry is a general partner at New Ventures. Moderating today's call is Paul Kenny, a partner at NEPC, and is on our philanthropic team. My name is Josh Beers. I'm a senior consultant on the research team, specializing in venture and growth equity investing. Today's agenda will cover the impact that COVID-19 has had on strategic investing, the speed of change in technology, and the power of innovation, and then more importantly, technologies that healthcare systems need to evaluate and ultimately embrace. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to address with you. Questions can be submitted in the chat bar and are highly encouraged. We'll be pausing about halfway through to address any early questions, and we'll leave time at the end. Highlights from today's webinar will be posted to our website, details to follow. Please save the date for our next event in the fall. Our guest speaker then will be Paul Wallace from Heritage Partners. I think that pretty much covers most of what we wanted to start the webinar off with. I'll pause briefly to see if there's any questions up front. Okay, seems like things are in order. Paul, Harry, take it away.
Yeah, so Harry, we've been chatting with you since going back to the first quarter, and it's hard to believe how much the world has changed since then. So just generally speaking, how are you and your firm handling life and the pandemic?
Well, I can tell you it's been busy. You know, trying to predict how the pandemic was going to unfold, which were, many of the conversations you and I had about, what was going to happen in the healthcare world, and at the same time trying to make sure that, all your clinical trials, you manage them as best as you can, and looking at the financial situation of each one of our companies and trying to coach them and manage them so that they get through. But I think so far so good. We had 2 companies go public in June, so that's in this sort of environment to have that happen was puts everybody in a good mood.
Good. Yeah, we've had conversations, and it seems like you've been handling it pretty well on a personal level as well, working from home and remotely.
Well, lucky, being always exposed to technology, I think, I've been doing video conferencing or some sort of remote work for, I don't know, a long time, longer than I think most people out there, but which made the transition a lot easier. And not getting on a plane, I can tell you, helps your sleep pattern a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that most of us haven't been in a plane since probably February at this point, which if you were to think about that a year ago, would have been, unheard of. Harry, yeah. Just jumping into it, I go back and think at the beginning of COVID and all those press conferences were on TV, and you have Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, and they were talking about bending the curve. And based on this graph that you put together, it looks like we got a ways to go on that front. So what do you think, or how do you think this is going to play out over time?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I get that question a lot. And, whenever I say, like, unfortunately, we've had, 52 different strategies, right, from a state's perspective, as opposed to a national strategy, which is, not the way to fight a war per se. But that said, I think, based on the direction that we're seeing, it could end up being a rough fall and winter, especially with the, onset of the flu season. And, you and I have talked a number of times, and I'm sort of looking at March being the tipping point of things starting to get better. I don't know if you saw, but yesterday Google announced that employees going back to the office wouldn't happen until July of next year. So this we've got a ways to go before this works its way out of the system in a sense. And COVID or coronavirus is never going to completely go away. It's just we're just going to get better at managing it and have therapeutics that can either be used protectively or eventually we will have a vaccine, which from what I can tell, looks like it could be January, late December, January.
Yeah, ahead of what would have been the historical time frame.
Yeah, it's been a really tough time. I mean, I've been talking to some of the people working on these products, and I can tell you won't meet people that are harder working. I mean, they're 24/7 trying to drive positive outcomes in the space and working at an unprecedented speed because of technology and the sharing of data that we've seen that I've never seen like this before. So I'll tend to read most of the papers that get published as opposed to listening to the news because I'm not sure the news is getting it right most of the time.
Yeah. So Harry, the topic of this was, technology and era of disruption, but there's also, maybe we should have worked in financial disruption into that title as well, because if we look on the next page here, it's just some staggering statistics. I look at this first bullet point, an estimated 18 million individuals stop receiving employer-sponsored healthcare coverage. And you just think about the pain that this has caused to individuals across the country and the world. And there are some pretty big numbers on here. You just speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that we're undercounting here. I mean, it's interesting, right? If you're not watching this almost on a daily basis, you're behind. It only takes you 2 or 3 days to be behind. But COVID-19 has sort of put an unprecedented level of stress on the entire system, especially the healthcare system, but the entire system. Now, I was just talking to a friend of mine that runs one of the hotels here in town, and he's like, we're off by 90%. And we've been off by 90% for the last, 4 or 5 months. And so you can imagine that takes its toll. But if you look at it from, the number of Americans filing for unemployment since the start of this continues to grow. I just saw a Kaiser Family Foundation report about 27 million people may lose employer-sponsored insurance. So it's even a bigger number than what we have up there. So, I mean, I can see sort of 3 big shifts taking place, at least in our world of healthcare. And, one is there's going to be a shift from commercial insurance to government funded insurance programs. Revenue, for funding Medicare based on payroll taxes is going to change. And, third, states are going to have less tax revenue to pay for Medicaid, which is going to cause a lot of financial stress in the world. So if you sort of trickle that down to the hospital systems, it's going to put a squeeze on margins. And we can talk about all the other industries, but healthcare is the one that I sort of tend to keep on my eyes on the most.
Yeah, and Harry, so along those lines, can you touch on that last bullet point we have on the slide there? On the impact of strategic investing and innovation specifically. I mean, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, right now, what I've seen is the institutions that had, a telemedicine arm, certain investments that they could make on remote monitoring, are more data driven from an aspect. They sort of were able to retool much faster than those that had not built in that optionality, or at least had exposure to that optionality. And right now you can see, and you and I have talked about this too, is this isn't just a one-time change. It's the the durability of this change is going to be farther lasting than I think we've seen any event like a 9/11 or something like that, where by the time this works its way out of the system, you've got to be investing and looking at where the change is happening to keep up with the way that the system is changing. The competitive landscape is going to change because of this. You're seeing CVS and Aetna step up to be places where they can do more testing, or at least collection centers for patients. Being able to do remote sample test acquisition, technologies like that are playing a larger role. Remote monitoring is playing a larger role. So institutions need to think about how they see these things and invest in these areas either directly or through a group that eats, sleeps, thinks about this change on a daily basis.
Yeah, so in this slide, Harry, we kind of talk about the broad impact of COVID, and then the slide you put together kind of takes it back down to the healthcare system level. And a couple things stand out to me. One here in the middle of the page is just the staggering $200 billion loss by healthcare systems in June. And you think that COVID probably only really started impacting them in March or maybe February. And then over on the right here, the elective procedures are slow in getting back to volume. It's been well documented, but do they get back to where they were?
Well, at least according to the numbers, they never really fully get back to to where they were. And I even think some of these numbers might even be optimistic. Technology is having a big impact on this, on people. I already hear people talking like, well, pre-op, do we really need to see the person in person? Post-op, do we need to see the person in person? I mean, there are certain dynamics where you do, but there's a lot of dynamics that you won't. GP general visits, do you really need to see all of them in person all the time? So a lot of this is really changed, and that's going to completely cause a reallocation of resources by these institutions, which is driving that $200 billion number. I mean, I think in the last week I saw some pieces coming about institutions that their numbers aren't too bad, but that's mainly driven by the CARES Act that got put in place that's sort of filling that momentary gap. So the fact that hospitals have these fixed costs and say thinner operating margins, right, puts them in a sort of uncomfortable financial position. And you have to think about what I said, on the last slide, talking about how there's a lot more people going on to the rolls of Medicaid, which means you may get a lower reimbursement and it might have margin pressure. And you and I talked about this a couple of months ago, but that sort of impacts borrowing capability. Mm-hmm. So you look at all these macro forces and you have to innovate your way out of it in a sense. I don't think brute force or staying on the exact same course is going to get everybody to where they want to be.
Yeah, and I think your comments on innovating out of it is a real good transition to this slide, Harry. And I noticed down the lower left here, you have the comment, health systems will need to double down on the new revenue approaches that can be scaled to rebuild their balance sheets. So that means business is not business as usual, and they're going to need to change how they approach their daily work.
Yeah, it was funny because I was working on these slides and I was thinking, oh my God, these few slides, they're like really negative. There's not too much positive that's in this, but this slide is sort of the turning point of sort of moving towards the positive. And it's sort of interesting because I'm trying to look at the bright side of COVID, which is, I think we're going to look back and say COVID was the most catalytic event for innovation that we've seen in healthcare. In my opinion, right, I think the advanced has pulled forward things by 5 to 10 years. And as the scale of this pandemic sort of grows and downstream impacts, right, I'm seeing a lot of healthcare organizations start to realize that they have to shift to what I'm terming as the new normal. And so the new normal is going to require new capabilities, forcing organizations to look externally for innovative solutions, right? And the stakeholders who want to survive and thrive in this have to understand and embrace this disruption, and navigate this real time, unfortunately. And it's just been a combination of things, Paul, not just the innovation themselves, but if you look at the shift of regulatory, they basically, the regulators on a state and federal level have stepped in to sort of unlock clinician supply and capacity, by removing barriers and creating incentives. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have, decided they would reimburse telehealth services at parity with in-person care. And I mean, that was huge. I could not have told you that was predictable. And if you think about it, patients are scared. They're not getting on planes. They don't want to go to hotels. They're willing to, engage in telehealth. Some patients may want that personal touch, but I think if you look at different age demographics, you'll find that people like me that are used to working in the technological age, I'm fine talking to my doctor through a telehealth service. Now, if you added a remote diagnostic with that, there's not a whole lot more that he needs to do with me right now. And even on the chronically ill, when I talk to my primary care friends, they're actually saying they like telehealth services because it gives them a view into the living quarters of some of these patients, so they get a better insight of what's going on. So I think you're going to see some significant shifts, and I want to make sure that I don't miss that last topic you and I discussed quite a bit, which is I think we're also going to see not just a technological innovation and an operational innovation that the providers need to make, but I think we're going to see a lot of providers add or merge into having an insurance arm. Because as you and I have discussed, like the people that actually did okay in this COVID dynamic were the insurers. And if you're going to move towards a value-based healthcare model, having an insurance arm is actually bodes very well from you from how to think about adopting these technologies and what they do for you, as well as the data that it gives you so that you can manage your patient population better.
Yeah, Harry, you've mentioned that you think that's almost absolutely necessary to get the right alignment between the healthcare systems and the insurers to get them on the same page and to break this reliance on revenues to drive profitability.
Yeah, I think it's, from all the people that I interviewed, even for my for my book, Moneyball Medicine, if you talk to those people that were self-insured, the innovations that they were willing to try or put in place, every time they worked, they saw a direct benefit to the bottom line. Whereas those that were, third party insured or needed some form of reimbursement, them putting something in place, it was tough to see the ROI from a business perspective. So, all of these areas, whether it's AI in operations or in your radiology department or your pathology department or some of these other things, the telehealth and AI and telehealth are going to play more of a role together as we go forward. You can see a lot of innovative change that really does affect the financials of the organization and the outcomes of the patient.
So Harry, we're going to stop in 1 second just for some questions that have been coming in. But before we do so, can you talk a little bit about that chart in the upper right, which talks about sort of the investing environment from, venture capital? Will funding be available for all these innovation opportunities?
I think there's been quite a bit of funding that's been available. I don't see, I mean, there was a little bit of slowdown at the beginning of the year, but you know, a lot of organizations have dry powder. There were some, you know, very, very large funds raised end of Q1 into Q2. So I don't see that slowing down at all. So, you know, I see this as a potentially robust opportunity to get into things. Now, one thing that's happened is you're seeing some of the funding move into later stage products. But I think that opens up an opportunity for someone to, you know, really hold a position in earlier stage technologies so that they can see where the curve is going and get ahead of it. Become, you know, test beds for some of these things that make sense. Be able to bring them on sooner than, say, maybe one of their competitors that are out there. And ultimately reap the financial benefits, assuming everything works out. So you get a, you know, it's almost like a 2-for-1 where you get the benefit of using it and trying it, and you get the benefit of the upside of the financial benefit of it.
Yeah, let's pause there. And Josh, any questions you would like to pass along to Harry?
Yeah, we've got a few. One of which, Harry, I know you have some strong feelings on, so looking forward to hearing your response on this. But you know, one, do you think we go into another shutdown come the fall? If I know the answer to that, then you know, what do you think that looks like for the healthcare systems kind of going forward until that March time period in which you've talked about being kind of the tipping point?
Well, there's a lot of ifs.
I told you you'd like that one.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny because somebody called me the other day. They're like, you know, I want to buy airline stocks. When do you think this is going to be over so I can buy? I'm like, you know, listen, do I look like I have the crystal ball? But that said, you can. I'm always watching the numbers, and each state is having its own issues. You can see how if numbers are not necessarily rising in the right direction, depending on the volume that a hospital is going to get, they have to rethink how they manage, you know, elective surgeries and, you know, primary care services. Now, a lot of them have taken on telehealth, so they're sort of starting to fill that the revenue gap from utilizing those technologies. But you know, if you saw a spike in this from a combination of, say, flu and COVID, it could turn the clock back from how their ability to handle this. I mean, they've gotten much better at it, but you know, at the same time, you know, I can tell you with somebody that has 2 kids in school, you know, we're constantly having a conversation of will they be back in school or not. So I think you're seeing a lot of unknown about where this is going to go, but I don't see this sort of clearing up until there's an announcement for a vaccine, which I think is going to get, you know, fast-tracked in a way that we've never seen before. I also think that, you know, the majority of these institutions really have to think about embracing technology. And, you know, I'll just give you a simple example why. If all of a sudden you start wanting to do imaging on all these people that have been waiting or postponing it, how do you get to all these people? I mean, you're going to have to work the imaging department, I don't want to say 24/7, but not far. You almost need to adopt technology to help you look at images, understand which one may need to get priority over another one, et cetera. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm trying to sort of give you a rounded answer about where this is going and how to mitigate your way out of it.
Okay, that makes sense. And it actually plays nicely into another question that we got. So when you think about telehealth, I mean, obviously that's gotten pulled forward quite a bit. Our last webinar, we heard over 40,000 cases going through telehealth. But would love to get your thoughts around kind of what you think the limitations may be with telehealth going forward.
So right now, I think, before we had all these barriers to telehealth, and I feel like all of a sudden, all the reins have come off, and now it's a free for all. Like you can use, FaceTime and, anything can, categorized under telehealth. So I think the pendulum has swung too far in that direction. I think if cooler heads prevail or they think about this, I think what we'll see is you'll need a HIPAA compliant health system. You'll see integration with EHR systems so that you can have patient records right there when you're on the phone with somebody. You'll have an overlay of some combination of machine learning and AI, so to help the physician navigate the critical points to identify within that record so that they can manage that patient better. I think you're going to see a lot of these changes take place. And I think, because it was interesting, I was talking to the person that's the futurist at Paramount Pictures, and we were talking about video interaction. And some of the things that you're seeing from that industry, I think you're going to start to see bleed into how we're going to interact with patients, where you can almost have two people sitting in the same room interacting with each other. And that's not as far off as I think people think it's going to be, especially based on what we're being forced into now because of this pandemic.
Great, thank you. Paul, that wraps up the questions that have come in thus far. Just as a reminder for those that are listening, you can submit questions using the chat feature, and we'll be pausing at the end to address any more questions that come through.
Okay, so we're moving into the solution part of the presentation, Harry, and we're going to talk about the speed of change in technology and the power of information. And these are some items that you've highlighted here that have really come to the forefront during this COVID crisis. And can you talk a little bit about where these technologies are going and their applications?
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's like as much as you can fit on one slide at one time. But you're already seeing digital technologies potentially playing a role in being able to identify something like COVID early. Now I say COVID today, but I think it's going to be other other diseases later on. But I think you've probably seen there's a little device that you put right on your throat there, and it can sort of measure your breathing. I was talking to the CEO of a company called Aura the other day for my podcast, and if you don't know Aura, it's sort of like Apple Watch, but for your, as a ring format, where it measures temperature. It has a, accelerometer in it, et cetera. And what they've noticed is that you can see temperature elevation 2 days before you start to feel the impact of COVID right now. And they've been doing some studies, and I have a feeling that when the paper comes out, it will say that you can actually see things 4 or 5 days earlier than when the person ends up feeling these results. And so they've done a deal with the NBA, I think 2 of the major casinos in Vegas, but it's a $200 ring, right? That's giving you 24/7 data on a patient. So you're seeing more and more come out of that. I mean, one of the companies that I was intimately involved with when we got it off the ground is a company called Evidation Health, where they were able to publish papers where they could see literally patients or people becoming much more sedentary right at the, when COVID came on and have been publishing on this. And they've just done a couple of other deals recently, which are quite interesting. And ironically, I think they just raised a $47 million Series C to give you an idea that, funding is not going away for companies that are worth funding. But digital biomarkers are going to be critical to identifying early disease. And I think I've told you this story, Paul, but like I have an Apple Watch and I have cardiogram on my phone. And one day when I clicked on the app, it popped up and first thing it said is, Harry, have you ever been diagnosed with sleep apnea? And I said, yes. And it said, are you being treated for sleep apnea? And I said, yes. And it said, thank you so much for contributing to our research. Now, if I had said no, I almost wish I could go back and do that, but I'm sure the system would have said, yeah, you may want to go have that looked at. And the reason they can do that is because they did, I think their clinical study was 127,000 patients with UCSF. And they were able to, with some 87% positive predictive value, tell you early onset of diabetes, sleep apnea, and arrhythmia, just based on one biomarker of your heart. So now you can imagine that if I can do your heart, maybe your blood pressure, your weight, your temperature, based on the Oura Ring or another measurement device, 3 or 4 biomarkers together that I'm looking at all the time, gives you some really good insight into how that patient is being managed. But the other areas, so clinical trials, if you can't see a patient, it's really hard to do a clinical trial. So you're seeing a boost in remote clinical trials or virtual trials start to grow. Drug discovery, I think you're seeing a huge shift using data and technology to identify targets faster. I'm not going to say easier, but much faster. A perfect example is COVID. When we did the SARS sequencing when I was at Applied Biosystems, it took us about 4 months. COVID, we got, was done in 2 days. And within 4 or 5 days after that, they already had the first targets identified to be able to drive the process forward. Now, most people think we're not moving fast enough. And I look at this and say, we're moving at light speed. So many different areas I could talk about.
Well, maybe Harry, let's talk on that last bullet point there in what's in italics, the benefit of being engaged in innovation and how that kind of leads to the opportunity to act when you need to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. So, and this is really recent, right? So CMS proposed this rule concerning value-based purchasing for prescription drugs, right, covered by Medicaid, to encourage payers to engage in this sort of arrangement around prescription drugs, right? And this rule has a lot of implications for, you want to make sure you're giving the right drug to the right patient at the right time. Your lab has to be involved. You need the data to make that decision. So if you're not on that, I'm not even going to call it the bleeding edge because it's not the bleeding edge anymore. I think it should be its standard of care. But if you're not investing in that, aware of that, embracing the software and technologies to be able to put that in place, it's moving at such a pace that I think you'd be missing some very large opportunities. And that's just one example of that. If you weren't invested or had at least some experience and some SOPs written around your telemedicine, when this hit, you didn't have that opportunity to scale it the same way that you could have. If you had a clinical trial going and you had no exposure to, say, remote monitoring technologies, could you pivot to keep a trial going after some modifications? So making these investments, either, like I said, either directly where you have that the capability to do so, or even if you had the capability to do it directly, utilizing groups in the field that are sort of looking at this 24/7. And I think you and I talked yesterday, Paul, about Facebook actually doing this themselves, where they're using small venture funds to broaden their eyes and ears to see the changes that are happening on the market, because they're happening so fast that even Facebook can't keep up with all of them.
Yeah, that was interesting, given all their resources and being such a well-known technology company. They're putting out feelers, so to speak, to make sure they're always abreast of what the most interesting and potential high impact technologies are that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I look, you can't complain. I've got a tremendously fun job, Paul. Right? I'm constantly looking at where the puck is going, weighing that against my experience in healthcare of what's really going to work, what's not going to work, but also thinking about the business model shifts. I mean, if you think about it, Amazon's not going to play the same game. CVS and Aetna are not going to play the same game. Walmart just filed to also be an insurer, so they're not going to play the same game. I think the game, because of the datafication of healthcare, is up for change. Some physicians will look at me and say that's heresy, but I'm sure that the people at Kodak said the same thing about digital photography. So
okay, so let's switch to sort of how this technology can be implemented and how healthcare systems can approach it. So Harry, if I'm not mistaken, all the items here are a chapter in your book in Moneyball Medicine. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so when I look at this, I think of this as a macro opportunity set of the trends that will be reshaping healthcare going forward. Then I look at that, if I'm a healthcare system, it's like, wow, there's a lot involved here. And it's like, where do I play and how do I get involved in these things in the right level? Do I partner? Do I just monitor some of these things? So how does a healthcare system stay abreast of all the things they need to think about?
Well, again, I think, putting together the right advisory boards, making sure your people are either attending the right conference or put on your own conference, which forces all the physicians at the head of departments to sort of get engaged and get involved, right, and engage in conversations. Utilize, funds, especially early stage, that can help you be eyes and ears and build a good communication portal to them, so that there's a good, healthy back and forth for two reasons. One is, what if your institution has a technology that it thinks it wants to commercialize? You can have a third party sort of be able to help you think that through, or bring something new to the table that you can implement or at least try at your institution. The interesting thing is, back in the day, like, I got an MRI, you got an MRI, right? It's completely changed. This datafication that's happening, and if you look at from a technology perspective and this list, there isn't one area that isn't being upended by how you're using data and where you're using that data and how how you're putting it in place. I think it's almost impossible for an institution all by itself to sort of be aware of all this, because that's not their primary function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in prior conversations, Harry, we talked about monitoring, partnering, and education as being the three keys to figuring out how you allocate your resources.
Oh, absolutely. I can tell you that I can't read enough. I cannot talk to people in the field enough. So I myself even have to pick my battles of what I can really dig deep into. And I'm not seeing patients on a daily basis. So you can imagine where I am versus where the people in the field actually doing this work are. Yet we've got to make them aware of what's happening and open to adoption, or at least trying this in a way so that you can see how it fits and where things are going. I mean, just like in every other industry where we're constantly retraining the staff, I think medicine needs to look at how the technology is changing and how it needs to be implemented to think about how they're going to implement it.
So I think when I look at this slide, I think macro, and then when we move to this next slide, I start thinking about micro, because what this slide really talks about is how digital health presents a wide opportunity set just within its own narrow vertical. And obviously there's a lot of different verticals out there. And maybe this was the theme of Moneyball Medicine too, Harry, in that when we started talking about all these segments on the left-hand side, you came back and said, the common theme here is they're all driven by data. So can you talk about the power of data and the role it's going to play looking forward?
Yeah, so if you think about it, I mean, there's a combination of two things. And one is the data itself, making sure it's in the right format, making sure it's usable, making sure that you've got enough of it. Otherwise, you're not making good decisions. And then the knowledge about how to use that data, right? Knowledge of where it's going to have an impact and how you manage things. And I think you're going to see that as the next phase of the evolution of the space. But if you don't understand the data, if you aren't working with it, there's a lot of things that you can't do, you can't participate in, and that falls across multiple areas. I mean, there's the operational implementation of data on how to run things better, and then there's using it more in a patient-oriented format, such as precision medicine or patient engagement platforms and telehealth or digital apps. All of these are areas that produce tons of data that an institution can utilize to manage their patient population better or their processes better. And I think you and I have talked about a couple of these where, an institution like Geisinger was able to sort of streamline their surgical procedures to the point where they were able to offer a money-back guarantee on surgeries, basically sort of driving a Six Sigma process through surgery, which, it's interesting. I was talking to Glenn Steele about this, and he said the biggest impediment were the people. It wasn't necessarily the process. Or how they put in a monitoring system for their type 2 diabetes population of 35,000 people, and within less than 3 years, they dropped their comorbidities by 25%. Now, I'm talking about a self-insured institution, so they're driven to want to experiment and make these changes. Third-party insured institutions are less enthusiastic about that shift from all the CEOs that I've interviewed. But there's a number of areas where you can see here, the predictive analytics space is booming, is growing. Utilizing AI and machine learning for image analytics is growing. It has its bumps in the roads. This isn't the panacea, but the rate of change is happening so fast that what people call roadblocks, I'm calling a bump in the road, because I'm watching the leapfrogging of these capabilities in a way that I've never seen before. I could talk to you about natural language processing, and about 2 weeks ago, a system got put out that has 175 billion features in it. We used to have to design separate NLP engines to do very, very specific tasks. This new engine that just got released, it makes all those separate tasks obsolete. So I think that an institution needs to have people that understand data, people that want to interact with data, play with data, understand how to implement these systems. Unfortunately, we're not graduating enough people to do all the jobs I'm talking about. I think the only way that this can work is institutions, through the power of investment, need to identify groups that they can work with that can help them be successful in the space.
Yeah. You know, the examples you shared with Geisinger, I found very interesting, because some of the stuff, when you think of all that's going on here, you're looking at breakthrough technologies. But a lot of innovation isn't the breakthrough technologies, isn't it more just smart blocking and tackling and good planning?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's some unique methods that can be borrowed from a lot of other industries, especially on the operational side for a provider system. And I did talk to a few people, in the book about basic operational things, not coming up with the next drug per se, that move the needle either on helping manage physician burnout, understanding which patients are going to show up and which patients don't. There's a lot of different, even that the diabetes platform that I was talking to you about, Geisinger, that was not a whiz-bang new technology. It was monitoring 35,000 patients, having the data come in remotely, pushing up the nurses so that they could interact with the largest patient population, and then pushing up the doctors to work with the more troubled cases, and driving to that outcome of that lower comorbidity issue. So you've got a healthy patient, a happy patient. You've got a patient paying a premium for insurance. So the institution is happy because it's making its money and it's not spending any money to take care of that patient.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. We're going to pause here too and turn it back to Josh for a second to see if we have a few questions.
Yeah, we had a couple come in. The first one being, should healthcare systems bring more data collection and processing expertise in-house, or focus on partnering with firms that can collect it, analyze, and present the system with those insights?
I think it's a little bit of both, depending on what you're trying to, the area that you're working on. There is the argument to be made that there are a few systems out there that are cloud focused or cloud enabled. So you're benefiting from data coming from multiple sources into one data set, which makes the results you're getting that much better because you're only as good as your data set. Then at the same time, you need certain data analytic capabilities in-house to do what is specific to your institution, patient population, et cetera. And there are systems now that are being worked on by Google and Microsoft, which are implementing federated capabilities. In other words, there are algorithms that you get to implement at your system, but because they go learn at everybody else's system, utilizing de-identified data, you get the best of both worlds. So it's a difficult answer there. I can't necessarily lean one way or the other on that answer. I hope that helps.
Okay. And then, obviously you spent a lot of time with data. This is a two-part question. Obviously you spent a lot of time with data, just given your history. What are some of the roadblocks on the data streams today? And then to follow that up, how has data changed, just due to the present time with COVID disrupting so much?
What are the roadblocks for data? Most of it is, and I can tell you this is not specific to providers. This is sort of universal. It's like garbage in, garbage out, right? Is the data coming in is good, it's clean, it's labeled and managed properly, so that you can do what you need to do with it on the next step, right? If you don't have good data to begin with, it's like bad ingredients for your soup might not taste as good. So that is one of the biggest impediments, and whether I talk to pharma or anybody else, these are the issues that are at play. However, the ability to generate data these days is getting cheaper by the minute, easier by the minute. There are different data streams that can come in from either different devices. But then your biggest issue is going to be data overload and being able to sift through that data so that you can highlight the items that are meaningful, that you can now have something actionable to do. And you can sort of, I think there are ways to sort of make a hierarchy on this so that you're not trying to bite off everything at one time. Hope that helps answer the question.
Okay. And then I think this is a pretty good question too. So assuming we beat back COVID-19 and a vaccine becomes effective, how should we, and I'm assuming it's coming from a healthcare system, be thinking about preparing for future pandemics?
I think, well, one, we need to prepare on a national scale. I think there was just a paper that was written in Science talking about what we need to do over the next 10 years to really prep on a national scale for this. But, you know, if you think about it from a business continuity perspective, having the ability and the choice to be able to see a patient or utilize digital technologies, I think gives you that optionality. I think people are going to be rethinking brick and mortar, at least the way that we think about it now, where everything is in one central location. You know, remote community-based capabilities, I think, are going to become a way that you can get to your population without everybody coming into one giant facility. Being able to interact with patients remotely, I think, is going to play a larger role as you sort of mitigate these issues for, quote, the next time that we come around, because we are going to have another pandemic at some point. These are a whole host of things that you can put in place over the next, say, 12, 24 plus months that would create buffers for the system. And to be quite honest, I always tell every company I talk to is, you know, do we have to do it the same way that we've always been doing it? Is there a different way to bring this thing to market? Because if we're going to do it the same way we need to do it, I mean, I know that system. Here's the reimbursement. Here's the regulatory. Here's, you know, that's easy to figure out. But thinking about, is there a different way to provide a service or manage a patient? I think those are the big business model shifts that we're going to see going forward, that providers need to really take into account so that they don't end up in the exact same situation that I think we're in today.
So Harry, in some ways that seems like it's a tie back to Moneyball, the book, because Moneyball was a book about a small market baseball team with limited resources and how they had to think differently to succeed. And their approach to success was using data and being different than everyone else. So does that philosophy apply to healthcare systems as well, do you think?
I think it does. I think it does. It's all about the implementation. And you have to look at each process and procedure sort of through its own lens. I mean, there are situations where you need to interact with the patient. That patient needs to be there. There are a lot of other areas where, you know, the patient can be remote or the image can be remote. I mean, they just changed the regulation where pathology images can be looked at remotely. You know, how can I put machine learning and AI on top of that to help me manage those slides? Which slide should I look at first? Did the machine see something that may be important to, you know, that physician? From a, you know, MRI or CT perspective is, which image might have an issue that I need to look at first. There are companies out there that are collecting more brain images than anybody on the planet and measuring it, whereas you used to do that sort of by hand, right? Click, drag your mouse, click, okay, it's this wide or this high or this thick, all being done in a fully automated fashion that takes seconds. It's not a huge leap between a fully automated measurement and suggesting a diagnosis, which can speed up what a physician is doing. It's not to take the place of, because the best combinations that we've seen are the data plus a person, not data on its own. I think we're quite a ways off from that.
Yeah. Harry, we're quickly approaching the top of the hour, so just want to touch on a couple of final points here. The first is on the screen is New Venture Funds, your logo. Our understanding is your logo is changing.
Yes, so we're right in the middle of rebranding. We're just about to launch the website. It might even actually be up today from what I know. We're changing the name to Scientia Ventures, so SCIENTIA Ventures. And the translation of Scientia is science, knowledge, and skill, which I think reflects how we've been looking at the market and the direction that the organization is taking and how it looks at the market. Paul, you'd asked me to sort of give you sort of a few areas that I think stick out after this whole talk. And, the three areas that I think in what I'm, thinking about as the great healthcare reset is, the shift to value-based care, I think, is going to move much faster, which is why I mentioned the insurance arm. Digitally enhanced care, I think, is really gotten a leg up during COVID. And I mean, unless something drastic happens, I don't see it slowing down. And finally, like thinking about automation and analytics from an institution and how they help use data and data analytic technologies to help make that smoother and easier as the process goes.
Yeah. Well, Harry, we're at the top of the hour, and this has really been great. And we appreciate all the time that you've spent with us over the past couple months working through the impacts of COVID-19 on innovation and strategic investing. Josh and I wanted everyone to know that if you wanted to reach out to Harry, you can see Josh and my emails on the screen. Shoot us an email, and we can put you in touch with Harry. And again, Harry, thank you so much for all your efforts with us and the second event in our Healthcare Innovation Leader Series. So I think, Josh, I think that wraps us up for the day. Anything you'd like to add?
Nope. Thank you for all that attended.
And we look
Thank
forward.
you very much for having me.
Oh, thanks, Harry. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to everyone attending future events. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.